I haven't come across many affordable large-size 1440p gaming monitors, so today we're looking at the iiyama G-Master GB3271QSU-B1. Yes indeed, it's an absolutely ridiculous name. Now this sports a flat 31.5-inch IPS panel that runs at a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate of 165Hz. It has support for adaptive sync technologies and also HDR. Now at the time of filming and in the UK it can be found for roughly £315, making it a tempting proposition. So in this review you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and how it competes to some of the other monitors that I've reviewed. Now before proceeding with this video I would just like to thank MSI for actually sponsoring it. More on them a little bit later. So jumping straight in, let's talk about its input lag, and here you'll be able to see two figures. Yes, there is one right away at the top at 0 milliseconds and one all the way at the bottom at 5.5 milliseconds, which is actually pretty bad. Now this is because the monitor has got two modes. There is a direct drive option that you can enable or disable via the monitor's OSD, and with it enabled you'll get a phenomenal input lag. So you might be quick to say, well, you're going to always want to leave direct drive enabled. Well, yes and no, because if you were to enable direct drive, it actually disables the ability of enabling AMD FreeSync or indeed NVIDIA G-Sync technologies and also HDR. So therefore you'll have to make a compromise. Do you want a tear-free gaming experience or indeed HDR but a higher input lag, or do you want that disabled but then have a better input lag? Personally for myself, I would much prefer a lower input lag, and that's how I went ahead and tested the gaming monitor when it came to my subjective analysis. While playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I felt that my mouse inputs were absolutely phenomenally good. I had no issues whatsoever when it came to registering my inputs, and therefore when it came to playing a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike 2, let alone some other games that I do play, I found that the monitor did respond extremely well. Now input lag is only one side of the story, so what about when it comes to its overall response time? Well, as a reminder, it has a refresh rate of 165Hz, which therefore will be suitable for most gamers, although hardcore competitive gamers will probably want to look at a higher refresh rate monitor. Now nonetheless, over here you have got a few different overdrive modes that you can select via the monitor's OSD. The higher the overdrive mode, it means that the faster the response time of the monitor will be, but at the caveat of you having a slightly worse visual experience. In other words, you'll get more inverse ghosting, and therefore means that it might throw off your shots or indeed just not look as good. Now for me to demonstrate this objectively, I'm using the OSRTD tool. Now here, there's the overdrive set at off, with the average initial time at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, which translates to the average G2G, which most manufacturers claim, sitting at 11.98 milliseconds. Now going to level 1, you can see that this figure reduces to 10.46 milliseconds. To level 2, it goes to 8.44 milliseconds. Level 3, it gets to 7.64 milliseconds. And level 4, it gets to 7.4 milliseconds. Now arguably over here, level 4 is the one I would suggest, because you are actually getting very little RGB overshoot, in other words inverse ghosting, and therefore might be agreeable to most people who are using this monitor for casual gaming needs. If however you want a bit more responsiveness from the monitor at the expense of that inverse ghosting, as you'll be able to see there's a bit more error on the RGB overshoot table, you can go to the level 5 mode, and this will give down an average initial time of 6.39 milliseconds. Now, in all honesty, at 165Hz, it's still not all that impressive. The average initial time should be a little bit lower for a modern panel, and alas, it's not. As you will see over here with the level 5 mode, the percent in window sits at 70%, where it should be hitting over 80 to potentially 90%, but that can be quite rare, specifically at a budget price point. Expanding on that and giving you my own subjective opinion, having reviewed over 250 different monitors, I will say that the monitor is perfectly acceptable for most gamers. And by that I mean if you're looking at a large size 1440p monitor at 165Hz, you're probably not a hardcore competitive gamer. And if you are, as I did say before, you might want to look at a different monitor altogether for a smaller form factor or indeed a higher refresh rate. At 165Hz and at this form factor, I think it's perfectly playable for playing MMORPG, RTS games, or any sort of other genre that doesn't involve fast-paced FPS shooters. So therefore, this monitor is perfectly usable for most casual gamers. Now when it comes to the overall visual experience, I did refer to it before when it comes to the RGB overshoot, but here you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test, which a lot of people like using and seeing. And as you'll be able to note that at the level 5 overdrive mode, there is a bit more inverse ghosting, and you can see that there is a little bit more highlights behind the lighter shades, and this can be noticeable in certain games, such as when I was playing the likes of Destiny 2, or even if I was just scrolling on my desktop and going through different text, I was able to notice that there was a bit more overshoot that was occurring behind written text. Now there is also an MBR mode, and this is effectively motion blur reduction. This can be quite handy for you if you do want to improve the overall motion clarity of the monitor. And yes, indeed, it does do exactly what it says on the tin, with the UFO becoming a lot clearer. At the expense, however, is that MBR cannot be used simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies or HDR, where the latter is no surprise, and also it will limit the overall brightness. There is 8 different level increments that you can choose from, and I'll go into the overall brightness figures further down in this video. Now, speaking about gaming fluidity and performance, this perfectly brings me on to today's sponsor, MSI. The manufacturer's new range of QD OLED monitors offer a refresh rate of up to 360 Hz. Fast response times, excellent HDR, impressive motion clarity, and flawless contrast ratios. MSI's exclusive gaming intelligent chip gives some hardware level advantages on games, while OLED Care 2.0 and the custom graphene heatsink helps prevent burn-in issues. You also have peace of mind as MSI provides 3 years of burn-in warranty. To find out more, click on the link in the description below or the pinned comment. So moving swiftly on, I would like to talk about adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Now the monitor has not got a native G-Sync module and therefore does not have the full VR range. Instead, it has a certification of 48 up to 165 Hz. This means that if you do fall within that range, you'll get a tear-free gaming experience. Now in my case, I've not got an AMD graphics card, but rather an NVIDIA RTX 3080. And when connected over DisplayPort, I was pleased to see that I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo without incurring any sort of black screen issues or flickering. And therefore, at least on my setup, I was able to get that tear-free gaming experience. Just bear in mind what I did mention before, that the direct drive option will be disabled if you do enable AMD FreeSync Premium via the OSD or indeed the likes of NVIDIA G-Sync via your NVIDIA control panel. So this perfectly brings me onto HDR, and quite frankly, the experience is subpar. Not only due to the overall color accuracy, which is actually pretty poor, but also due to the overall peak brightness this monitor can achieve, which sits at roughly 400 nits, and as such won't compete with some of its competitors, let alone some more expensive alternatives out there that will get the Display HDR 600 certification, therefore giving you a much more lifelike reproduction. And yet again, just as a reminder, you're not going to get that direct drive option either, so therefore you're going to get a lot more extra input lag if you're running an HDR signal. I would also like to highlight over here that I did find it quite baffling that the monitor was not smart enough to automatically trigger HDR on the monitor. In other words, if you were to enable HDR on Windows, most monitors would automatically realize there is an HDR signal and therefore automatically give you the HDR mode via the OSD. But unfortunately, that's not the case with this iiyama monitor, and as such, you'll have to faff around with the OSD every single time if you enable or disable HDR, and therefore have to toggle the HDR option on and off. An oversight by the manufacturer, at least in my opinion. Past the gaming performance, let's talk about image quality. And as a reminder over here, you've got a 1440p monitor with a 31.5-inch form factor, and therefore will have lower pixel density in comparison to a 27-inch monitor or indeed a smaller monitor out there. And it has got a flat IPS panel with a matte coating to it. The monitor does not have a dedicated sRGB mode, and therefore in its normal preset I had its gamut coverage tested at 96.4% and its gamut volume at 108.2%, of course in comparison to the sRGB standard. Below you can see how it compares. Now the average delta E sits at 2.92 and a maximum sits at 5.87. In other words, this monitor cannot be used for serious image editing work or video grading. Now its tested contrast ratio was sitting at 1060:1, which is acceptable for an IPS panel, although a little bit below what I would expect, while its measured white point sat at 6609 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it does actually sit a little bit off from the 2.2 standards. Now for those with a keen eye, you might have noticed the brightness figures, and yes, in HDR I clocked in 398 nits, which is close to what the manufacturer quotes. As for SDR, it sits at 317 nits, which in my opinion is still plenty bright of using this monitor in a very light room. Most of the time I use this monitor at roughly 80 to 70% brightness. As for its minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 30 nits, showing good sort of range. And as such, if you're someone who's going to be using the monitor in a completely pitch black room, I think it's actually still very usable because it does get pretty dim. Speaking of which, over here, the MBR levels will lock the brightness at a set amount. And you can see here from the range from 259 nits all the way down to 41 nits. Very much on the subject of luminance, this brings me on to brightness uniformity. And here you'll be able to see how my tested panel performed across the board. I do appreciate it's somewhat lottery. But in this respect, given the size of the monitor, I was actually left pretty impressed. The same could be said about the overall backlight bleed, which in my opinion was actually pretty good. It was actually quite minimal and therefore meant that even in a completely pitch black environment, as were the pictures were shown, I just didn't feel that it actually threw me off, be it in terms of playing dark games or watching dark movies. But of course, if this is something that's going to be bothering you in the slightest, then you might want to look at a VA or a TN panel instead. So past all these tests, let's talk about its overall build quality. And here the 31.5-inch monitor does actually have a relatively small form factor, and this is due to the fact that it's got a three-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. Now in terms of the monitor's stand, it's actually very sturdy and provides you height, tilt and swivel adjustments. Although it can be pivoted as well, but here there is a sticker that comes within the box that tells you not to pivot it. It's also not listed on the specs either. Now if this is something that you are going to be looking for, then you might want to replace the stand. And thankfully over here you have got the ability of replacing it with a VESA compatible stand, allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now past all of that, you might have noticed that at the bottom right hand side of the monitor there are a few physical buttons, and yes indeed these are to access the monitor's OSD. Now better still, the manufacturer has provided you a wireless remote, which makes it all that bit easier to adjust settings from a fly, be it if you're going to be changing input or indeed just accessing the OSD itself. Speaking of which, over here the settings are actually very intuitively laid out and also very responsive, so I had no complaints whatsoever. Now there is also the volume setting, and yes indeed this monitor has got two 3-watt speakers built in. They're not exactly all that great, but it's nice to see them included, just in case you want it for basic music listening or indeed notifications. You have also got a 3.5mm jack underneath the monitor, which allows you to route audio to a set of headphones. Now this does actually perfectly bring me onto connectivity, and here there are two HDMI 2.0 ports and two DisplayPort 1.2 inputs. The latter will give you the maximum refresh rate and resolution, while the former will limit you at 1440p at 144Hz. Now elsewhere, there are also 4 USB Type-A ports, 2 of which are found underneath and 2 which are conveniently placed on the left-hand side. These are of course only accessible if you have the USB Type-B to Type-A cable, which is supplied within the box, connected to the monitor. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict. And truthfully, the iiyama monitor is not a bad shout if you want a relatively large size monitor on a budget and a 1440p resolution. However, I do think there's some other alternatives out there that you should consider, some of which are reviewed and will be down in the description below for your own consideration. These monitors will give you either a better responsive panel or indeed a higher refresh rate, better color accuracy, better HDR, or indeed have not got the likes of AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync locked behind a certain setting, which effectively increases the overall input lag. So therefore, I would suggest you to look elsewhere. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, and of course if you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I hope we see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.